Hello and welcome to the 17th episode of Tailoring in Conversation. In this series, I'll be talking to tailors from all around the globe to gain a better insight into their worlds. My guest for today is Tony Bader. Tony is a pattern maker and garment designer and is experienced in both traditional and digital pattern making. We're going to be talking about made to measure, manufacturing, the role of tailoring in society, digital pattern making, and more. And I hope that it's going to be interesting. So let's get started. Thank you for making the time, and I'm glad to be talking with you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm very glad to be talking to you as well. And yeah, really appreciate the invitation.
Great stuff. First question I have is, who were you at 10 years old?
When I was 10 years old, I would describe myself as like kind of an internal child, I guess. I don't know if that sounds strange, but like I wasn't super interested in like going out and sort of playing sports and doing those sort of typical 10-year-old boy types of things. I liked to draw a lot. I liked to read a bit. I liked to like watch TV, play video games, things like that. I like to read comic books. But yeah, I think when I look back at who I was when I was 10, I think drawing was really kind of like the thing that I was very interested in and sort of motivated me and excited me. I always had like a clipboard of paper that I would just draw on with a mechanical pencil and all different kinds of, superheroes that I would make up and things like that. Just kind of anything that struck my, mind. Yeah.
Was there a major influence in pushing you towards drawing, or did that just naturally happen?
I didn't at the time. I definitely didn't like experience it as an influence, but my both my parents were artists in that they were photographers. They actually sort of like built a dark room in our home, and photography was sort of something that was all around me. I didn't at the time. It's funny. I didn't think of it as like an art form. It seemed more like a mechanical thing, like more, I guess, sort of like a hobby or something like that. But it never really struck me as sort of like it never struck me as similar to my drawing at the time. And then also, now that I think about it, my dad's father, my grandfather, was a sign painter,
Hmm.
and I never met him, but I think that sort of carried through genetically, perhaps. Later on, I definitely got sort of like interested in lettering and calligraphy and things like that. And that was, both his livelihood as well as kind of his pastime was sign painting. And, from what my dad would tell me in his spare time, when he would, be spending his time in the evenings, he would always sort of have a notebook where he would be practicing his lettering and calligraphy and things like that. So I think I sort of got that influence indirectly from him as well.
And did you have anyone fashion related or tailoring related in the family?
Nobody formally involved in tailoring. My father was always very interested in how he presented himself. His clothes weren't always necessarily like the nicest clothing. He didn't spend a lot of money on his clothing, but to him it was very important that like his shoes were shined, that his shirt was tucked in, that his the shoes matched the belt. He always wore bow ties. He was sort of known for wearing bow ties, and he was definitely not adventurous in his style choices. He was always sort of very conservative. Like he essentially dressed the exact same way for the entire time that I knew him. But it was very important to him. And that, when I was younger, he would always tell me, tuck your shirt in, and that kind of thing. And at the time, it seemed I was like, tuck my shirt in. I'm going to, I'm 9. What are you talking about? But it was always clothing. Always was very important to him, and presentation was always very important to him. So yeah, it didn't strike me at the time. It's like, you kind of put together these influences later on as an adult. At the time, it never struck me as fashion or tailoring necessarily, but that influence was kind of always there, and that importance of it, that importance of the way people perceive you, and that you are sort of like showing respect by presenting yourself in a certain way, was always sort of an undercurrent, I think, of my childhood and my relationship with my dad.
When I look at your work, and you've probably heard this before, the vibes I get are very futuristic vibes, very
Mhm.
geometrical. Is that something you've kind of like developed since you were a child up until now, or did you have different interests and then suddenly you got this awe-inspiring experience and then your inspiration changed? How did that go? Is this something you've been developing for a long time?
I've always been interested in, I guess you could say like science fiction, futuristic things. Like I've always been excited and interested in sort of like the future and technology and sort of all different types of expressions of that. I would say more and more. I also like from a fashion perspective, from a clothing perspective, I'm almost more influenced by like industrial design and architecture and things like that more so than I am fashion and clothing. And I love fashion and clothing, and I'm very sort of like excited and interested when I see things that really sort of vibe with me. But it's I often kind of think, to me, I don't think of myself necessarily as being futuristic, and I don't mind it when people say that it does look futuristic. I definitely sort of see where that's coming from, but to me, it almost seems more. It seems more like in a day. When you look at cars, when you look at modern buildings, when you look at consumer electronics, when you look at things that are being produced today, to me, it's like clothing. So much of the clothing that we wear almost looks like anachronistic compared to that. So I see it less as sort of like being futuristic and more as just being sort of like modern and for today, if that makes sense. I think so often when you look at staples of menswear, whether it's, the suit or trench coats or, like Levi's trucker jackets or just denim in general, so much of it was introduced at least like 50 years ago. I think like when I look at sort of like the staples of men's wardrobes, the kinds of things that you see people wearing in style blogs and GQ and things like that. The most recent addition to that, I would say, is probably like Vietnam era military clothing. You see that sort of, like olive green field jackets and things like that. I think of it as being kind of the most recent addition. And that would have been circa 1970 something. So it's like we've had 50 years of development of aesthetics and culture and society and all of that. And obviously you can sort of like have tailoring that advances with that. But to me, it's like I'm sort of interested more in like what the next sort of staples of menswear are going to be and sort of what the sort of new design language is going to be, more so than necessarily like looking to the past. Like I've heard stories of like designers and design assistants for like major labels who what their design process is by looking through archives, going to thrift stores, going to flea markets, things like that, and trying to find sort of like really interesting, exciting things from the past, and then sort of like redeveloping them. And that's how sort of like, so much of like our modern clothing is made. And to me, it's like I'm more interested in kind of pushing that aside to a certain degree and creating kind of like my own shapes, my own silhouettes, my own sort of methods of constructing sleeves and collars and things like that, and kind of exploring like what can come next. And so, yeah, to kind of get back to your question, I think that's always been something that's kind of like been churning inside my brain. I don't think there was like a specific moment when I, came out with it necessarily. But yeah, it's something that I've always been kind of interested in and I think I'm more like emotional and visceral with the clothing that I make rather than being sort of like intellectual. Like sometimes people ask, like, oh, what inspired you to make this? What motivated you? And to be honest, it's like, I just kind of make the clothes that I want to wear. I don't set out a explicit goal. I just kind of make what I feel I want to wear, if that makes sense. So, and that's been sort of developing and refining over time. Yeah.
Well, it seems it's a difficult thing that you're doing because, when we look at menswear, we are basically re-articulating or just rephrasing what has already been articulated by, like you say, people from 50 years ago or whatsoever. But what you're doing, it seems that, I don't have enough knowledge of clothing design within like a futuristic outset, but from what I've heard you just mentioned is that you make things that you like to wear, but it also seems like it's very experimental for you, and at the same time it's you're trying to test how far you can push it until it becomes unrecognizable as a garment, right?
Yeah.
And so for me that's almost like that's within the artistic domain. You're then finding yourself within the artistic domain. Yes, you are partially technician, yes, you are partially designer, but you're also looking for something that may not really be from now, but could be. So a lot of anticipation and speculation for that matter. Do you think that tailoring and art or fashion, fashion is probably more artistic because there's just a lot more creativity, but tailoring in
Hmm.
general, let's say garment construction in general, do
Hmm.
you think that art has a place in garment construction and tailoring?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's, I think I think art is such a loaded word,
Hmm.
especially today. And um, even like design has become sort of a loaded word. And it has so many sort of, um, notions behind it. Like I think oftentimes when people think of like clothing designers, especially like fashion designers, they think
Hmm.
of something, someone like a poet or something like that,
Yeah.
rather than someone who's more like an architect or something. I think when you think of a an architect or an industrial designer, you think of sort of a person with glasses who
Yeah.
a drafting table who's like doing calculations and math is involved and things like that. Whereas when you think of a fashion designer, you think of somebody with like wearing feathers or something with doing like a few impressionistic brushstrokes and says some kind of like living work of art kind of thing. And I think tailors sort of occupy, I think, in the social headspace and the social consciousness somewhere like between those two. They're technicians,
Hmm.
but there's still an air of I don't know how to put it, but an air of sort of expression, I guess.
Hmm.
And I think oftentimes clothing. I think there's always going to be space for creativity and for development. I think that there's always going to be a space for art and creativity in it. I think in every kind of like human endeavor and every human pursuit, there is creativity and expression there. I once heard somebody say that people think creativity is like having purple hair or tattoos or just
Hmm.
being weird or something like that. In creativity is everything that humans make. It's new philosophical ideas. It's new
Hmm.
political ideas. It's new ideas for how society can be ordered and organized. And it's also paintings and music and these other things that we sort of more closely think of as creativity. And yeah, I think, anytime somebody sits down to make uh, clothing, they're going to do something interesting, creative, different, even if it is subtle in their own way. I think um, nobody gets excited to just make the exact same thing that's been made 1,000 times. And I think even when you have these sort of subtle iterations on things, like I think of tailoring so much as like it's subtle iterations. It is taking a fairly crystallized form and idea. A suit has typically a pretty specific guardrails in place. There's
Yeah.
one, two, or three buttons. There's a lapel. There's a collar. There are sleeves, set in usually with some sort of roping. There's usually a structured chest piece. There's pockets. There's a pretty solid framework there, but within there, there's still a lot of room to play and a lot of room to, make new ideas with, subtle shapes of the lapel. Does it have belly? Is it razor sharp? Is it peak? Is it notch? Is it something different altogether? Is it some weird shawl? Is it, how high is that collar up on the neck? Is it sort of like long, lean Edwardian lines? Is it loose, slouchy, something more bohemian looking? So I think there's always going to be that room for creativity. And again, I think, um, you know, creativity isn't purple hair. It's not punk. It's not something like that. It can be that, but it can also be Edward Sexton. It can also be you know, these very sort of like polished, dressed up expressions as well.
And if we would do a little dissection here, where would you say that creativity and, let's say, let's keep the word art out for a second, right? Because like you say, it's too loaded for a 1 hour conversation. But where do you think that creativity is the most needed at the moment within the garment construction tailoring domain?
I mean, I would say, I'm in New York and I spend a lot of time in the garment district, and you meet a lot of aspiring designers. And I think there are so many people with ideas that are sort of these broad, creative, loose things. There are people with more ideas than there are actual like construction skills.
Right.
And so to me, I very much think of like my own work as, like I think of myself as like designer as pattern maker, if that makes sense. Like I rarely will draw sketches. I usually will just sort of go in and start playing with a pattern. And I think to me, like I wouldn't say I'm interested in designing. I would say I'm interested in making, and I think that is relatively rare. I don't want to, act like I'm special or unique in that. But I do think there's so many more people who are more interested in doing sort of like sketches or collages or color stories or things like that than people who really understand how to make clothes and how to put them together. And I think people often don't realize how much ground is there. I don't think people understand. I think people think of a pattern maker as like you can go to school for 3 years or something and learn pattern making, and that it's sort of like a very finite skill set that like once you know how to draft a sleeve cap, that's it. You're good. You can now go and you can make anything, and somebody can hand you a sketch and you can make that, or you can make your own sketch and you can make that. But I think to me, there's such broad territory to explore there from fit perspectives, from silhouette perspectives, from construction perspectives. And I think especially when you get into like tailoring, especially where you're really kind of defining like the form and structure, and you can get into shoulder pads and chest shapes and things like that. I think that there is so much room to explore there. And I think it's also sort of like the harder path to go down. It's sort of, I mean, I don't want to say that something is easy that I haven't done, but to me, it's like it's easier to sort of like do sketches. Again, I feel like some people, and that's going to upset some people, but like, to me, like learning pattern making, learning tailoring, learning construction, those things are hard. It's a long path to go down. And I think so many people are sort of, they see, creative directors who are doing these sort of almost kind of like, I feel like so often when you look at like the mainstream fashion industry, it almost seems like a stunt sometimes. Like there'll be sort of, it's based on like gimmick and novelty, and people are, I think, are more sort of like interested in going down that route because it's I think it's easier. Whereas sort of really doing like good design work with good construction, with good fit, with intentional designs and shapes, I think that's a much harder path to go down. But that is where really, to me, I think I would love to see more people investing their time and creativity in the actual construction. And it's, I think so often, a jacket is a body with sleeves and a collar, and people sort of stay within that, and to me, I think it's much more interesting to kind of like, what if it didn't have that? What if you have, like, I do a lot of like unusual raglan sleeves because I like to me, sort of like, there's kind of the most going on right here when it comes to a pattern, and to think about like, how can I get rid of this usual sort of like set-in sleeve that we have, and even kind of rid of the standard raglan sleeve, and instead do something totally different to create sort of an anatomical structure, while at the same time kind of rethinking it all together. So yeah, to me, that's where I think there is sort of the most room and excitement for creativity.
I think you're right, and obviously you're not thinking about high armholes, but also saying that it's easier to, let's say, make a sketch than to make the actual construction is absolutely true. And I think the reason for that is you can get away with a sketch that doesn't look professional by saying this is just how I felt at the time. 2 lines and like three.
It's my style.
Exactly, it's my style. Whereas if you misconstruct a garment, everyone can see. Even the untrained eye can tell, hey, something is not fitting correctly there. So
Hmm.
I think you're right. Now, I also know that you're speaking from the perspective of someone who's working now with the gift that we have from technology nowadays with 3D software that simulates
Hmm.
clothing. Obviously, that's a big game changer. Now, can you tell
Hmm.
us a little bit about when you started using those, how your experience in general is with 3D software and pattern cutting software?
Yeah, I started using. So I first started using like digital pattern making software. I started with just Gerber, just sort of flat. It's essentially it does. I would say it's the word processor equivalent of just writing with a pen, where you are essentially making flat pattern shapes digitally. It still requires kind of all the same pattern making skills in the same way that like a word processor isn't going to teach you how to write. You still have to know how to make patterns. But Gerber just looks like flat two-dimensional shapes. I started doing that 7 years ago, 8 years ago. And I immediately found it to be much faster and smoother and more efficient than doing paper pattern making. I often get pushback from people who are traditional paper pattern makers that it's sort of easier or that it is less true in some way than sort of paper pattern making. To me, I mean, I choose to respectfully disagree. I once had somebody ask me, like, "Oh, well, isn't it easier to use a computer to make a pattern?" And I sort of responded. I didn't mean this to sound snarky, but I responded by saying, "If by easier you mean you get better results with less effort, then yes, it is easier." And I think that's it. You know, if you want to, you can sort of copy and paste a piece rather than having to cut it out, trace it, and recut that. You know, it's just smoother, faster. I was going to say better, but I'll leave that up to the interpretation of the listener. I would say smoother, faster, more efficient. So I started doing that 6 or 7 years ago. I think maybe let's say seven, maybe eight, but I'm not sure. And then I started using Clo. I forget when I very first saw it, probably 4 or 5 years ago. And when I first saw it, it seemed incredible, like the sort of promise of it. And I downloaded it relatively quickly and sort of started playing around with it. It is, and it's gotten more powerful in that time. To me, it is, if you can sew and you can make patterns, it is relatively intuitive, I would say. I also had some 3D background. I'd played around with different like 3D modeling software at that point already. So I might have had some of that. But to me, I once did a 3-day workshop where most people didn't have experience with it, and half the people were from the fashion industry and half the people were from the 3D animation modeling video game industry. Learning how to use it for I guess they use it for 3D animation as well. And they had a much steeper learning curve than people coming from the apparel industry. Because if you already know how to sew, if you already know how to make a pattern, you're essentially doing that digitally. And it essentially kind of gives you a little sandbox that has physics that mimic fabric. And it just sort of makes you take your patterns that you could make them in Clo, or you can make them in a different piece of software. And you could, and you just, it models those exactly. And you have an avatar that can either be a shape that you've made, you know, a person that's sort of a hypothetical person, or you can use a body scan. And you can sort of fit clothing on it. And it's not perfect by any means, but to me, I find it extremely powerful and extremely helpful. And, you know, before you even print a pattern or cut any cloth, you can already sort of iterate and see it. And there is a bit of a learning curve to sort of like tuning your brain to seeing things in this little 3D window. But it's hugely powerful and hugely beneficial, I think. To sort of iterating. To me, like I always say, like design is an iterative process, and the more iterations you have, the better it will get. The better you get, hopefully, the fewer iterations you need to get to your goal or to get to a point that you're satisfied with. But the faster that you're able to iterate, the better your results are going to be. And so to me, Clo and other 3D design software just sort of lets you iterate faster and more times, and sort of really lets you see things that otherwise you would only be able to just sort of like have in your head and would have taken you you would have to either print it out and then cut the cloth, sew a muslin, put it on a form to really get a sense of what it's going to look like in 3-dimensional space. But yeah, Clo lets you do that in minutes, basically.
So obviously there are many, many benefits that you've just named in having a software that simultaneously simulates all the changes you make to a pattern. What do you think the long-term impact is going to be of that technology?
I think it's hard to say. I think oftentimes technology has unintended consequences. I think oftentimes people sort of like can't see the long-term implications of things until until you're there, as I think we're sort of seeing with social media and all different kinds of technology now. It feels like everything has kind of gone sideways a little bit, where it felt so kind of like utopic 10 years ago. So it's hard to say where it's going to take us necessarily. I think it's going to make things a little bit more accessible in that. So I always have felt that clothing and sewing is one of the most accessible forms of design and expression and kind of anything you want to do. It's I think remarkably accessible. I think people oftentimes, especially like in the West, have totally lost track of how clothing is actually made. But the fact of the matter is, if you can get a sewing machine, you can get some pattern paper. It doesn't even need to be pattern paper, just any paper, and you can start making patterns, cutting cloth and sewing things this afternoon, even if you've never sewn before. Whereas other things might require you, like if you want to, it's very accessible in a way that a lot of things aren't. And I think that Clo will only sort of make it more accessible and will make it easier for people to get involved. Especially like when I first started using Gerber costs $13,000. It's wildly expensive. Whereas Clo, I think it's like $50 a month or something like that, which is still not cheap by any means, but it's much more accessible than that $13,000 price tag. So I think you're going to be able to see more people getting involved and in making their own clothing. It also looks exciting in a way that I think may attract people more than, traditional home sewing does. So I'd like to think that it will get it'll get more people involved with more ideas, and that will sort of only benefit all of us. That's what I'd like to think it is. It might also, I don't know, I was going to say it might make people think making clothes is easier than it is. But I also think like when you're making things in Clo, you are making the patterns for all intents and purposes. So I think it sort of opens people's minds to that and sort of lets people, like a lot of people don't even know what a pattern is. When I tell people I'm a pattern maker, they think I'm talking about like plaids and polka dots and things like that. They don't think I'm talking about flat pattern making, So, yeah, I'd like to think it'll get more people involved. I'd like to think it will make the people who are making it and using it better at what they do with more sort of exciting, nuanced, executions by getting a chance to sort of again iterate faster. I'd like to think that's the result, but I guess we'll see.
What do you think about this? Do you think that a program like Clo, where you can make a pattern, make changes to the pattern, simultaneously simulate the changes and everything, choose your materials, all of that, do you think a program like that creates better technicians? And let me give you some background of why I asked that question. Because I'm trying to learn these softwares as I go along, because I don't want to stay behind in any way. But they're great tools as well. But then as I was working on this, I thought, well, you mentioned this before as well. If you don't know how to make a pattern, it's still a tool that you cannot use to the most optimized potential that it has. And I thought maybe these are more tools that help you to articulate your vague creative idea without having to worry about being too technical. Because sometimes, like if you're making an actual pattern and you have a weird neck circle, on the person, it just becomes a disaster. But in Clo, you can have like really weird pointy lines and it still drapes nicely. So what do you think of? Do you think it's going to train people better, or?
I definitely see your point that you can that there are things that wouldn't work in real life that can work in Clo. And I think it will. To me, where I would see kind of like the downfall with Clo. So like I've gone to a few of these different like workshops and a few of these different presentations where they tell you about the promise of the new future where we'll all be making clothes on computers and living in the metaverse and things like this. But and there's so often this sort of future that is foretold by software companies where we will where you will never have to make a sample. You won't even have to see the garment. Like you'll just be able to make a 3D version and you'll put the render online and it'll be for sale. And there won't even be the sample made until somebody purchases it. It'll be made to order and it'll be drop shipped directly to them from the micro factory that's located somewhere that you don't even have to worry about. And it's like, I don't think that will ever happen. I think the idea that you will be able to make a physical product only working virtually is a false idea.
Why do you think that?
To me, there is something about even if Clo and any other software could work perfectly and could give you a 100% accurate depiction of how it looks, it can't tell you how it feels, And I think that to me, I am primarily interested in clothing from the wearer's perspective, from the worn experience. I am very uninterested in sort of like seeing things on forums and runways and things like that. I'm interested in sort of putting clothes on, seeing how it feels, seeing how the fabric feels, seeing the range of motion, where the pockets, how do I put my things in it? How, when I go on out for a day and I have to take my wallet and my keys and all, like, how does it perform sort of in that worn experience? And I think, something like Clo, even if it gives you a 100% accurate depiction of what the garment's going to look like, it's not going to tell you how it feels. And I think that is a thing that, I think people sort of get away from that sometimes. I was speaking to a friend who's a software developer, and he was talking about how, like, it doesn't make sense to have offices anymore. We should all be remote all the time. We should all be, working from home. And I said, but your perspective is coming from somebody who makes a digital product, which is fine, but like apparel, garments, clothing, it's always going to be a physical product. I mean, there's people doing things where it's like it only exists in the cloud or something. There's people doing things like that. But as far as like clothing that is actually eventually made out of, real fabric and fibers that you put on your body, that is always going to be a physical object and will always require making a physical sample, feeling it, seeing it in person. So will it make worse technicians? I think it may lead people to think that they are better than they are. And they might have a bit of a rude awakening once they sort of really start to print those patterns, cut that cloth, and actually sort of start putting it together. And, I think it is, I think also, like, I sometimes compare it to music, and that, like, I think music has become dramatically more accessible in the last 10 years, and that you can sort of download software on your computer that can give you all the tools that you would have had to go to a studio for. And the difference is that once you have that digital music file, like, that's the finished product, And so even if it doesn't matter whether or not you're actually good or not, it's just that file and that's the finished product. Whereas with clothing, if assuming you do want to make a physical object, you have to print it, you have to cut it, you have to sew it. And if you put it on and it does fit wonky or weird, then you're not going to have a good product. And I think, skilled people people always end up seeing the difference, if that makes sense. I think, like, if there's somebody who is saying that they are skilled or even believes that they're skilled, when people see that product, they'll know the difference. And it's, I think Clo is a powerful tool. I don't think it is the be all end all. I don't think it's going to be that final product. I think you're still going to have to sort of make garments and make clothes.
One interesting thing you talked about, and I'd like to talk more about this as well, is that you think a lot about the functionality of a garment, and specifically the functionality of how the wearer is using their pockets, or how the garment is facilitating movement, things like that. And you can take that to a very extreme level, and then it all becomes about the utility of the garment and how it maybe makes you efficient, or it makes you faster in something. how far can one take that, you think? Because I can perfectly imagine that this is a bit of a fantasy, right? But if you have a series of clothing that makes every person 15 minutes more efficient throughout their day, then you multiply that obviously by whoever is going to wear that, and then times 365 days throughout the year, and then you have just a percentage of a more efficient society. Do you think I'm being a bit silly here, or is that a genuine thing?
No, so I definitely don't think you're being silly. But I think that, when it comes to clothing, so I think like utility in clothing is sort of like an interesting thing to think about because, kind of how we were talking about like designers versus like architects versus designers earlier, an architect has to have a certification and he really has to do math. And there are like real consequences to if a building like doesn't work. If someone's been making a building or a bridge or a car and it doesn't work, like people die. It's like there's real consequences to it. Whereas when people make clothing and it doesn't work, however you want to define that, there's not real life consequences, so I think, and which I think is also kind of why in the apparel industry that there have been people who have been able to present themselves. This is kind of going on a tangent from the question, but you see these people who do kind of present themselves as poets and who, do these things because it's like what they make doesn't have to work, But when we talk about like utility in clothing, which is the idea of like, how does clothing work and how can it work as well as possible? It depends what you want that clothing to do. And to me, clothing always exists and sort of has to work in addition to just the raw functionality of like, is it comfortable? Does it protect you? Does it hold the things that you need it to hold, that kind of things. There's also sort of like an aesthetic, social, emotional capacity in which it has to work. So if you had the perfect gray jumpsuit that was, kept the wearer cool, comfortable, and protected and provided all the things that somebody needed throughout their day, it wouldn't work when they went to a wedding or to a job interview or met their fiance's parents, or, you know what I mean? It's like there's all these social contexts in which clothing has to work as well. That is as important, or I think oftentimes to a lot of people, even more important than the actual function of that clothing. So, I try to think about kind of all these things in that, like, when I think about clothing and what I want it to do for me, I want it to keep me comfortable. I want it to keep me sort of like safe, protected, secure. I also want to feel sort of like capable in it. I want to feel like I have agency. I don't want to feel like there's a lot of things that I can't do. I think we've all sort of had that experience where you have, a particular piece of clothing on and you're kind of like, oh, I don't want to lean on the subway railing or whatever. It's like you want to feel like you can kind of do whatever, like you can move, you're comfortable, you're capable, you have agency, But I think clothing is sort of like a uniquely visceral form of expression in that you want to feel like you are the person who you want to be, kind of, and few of us, I think, want to be a person wearing like a spacesuit or something like that. So, yeah, I forgot what the initial question was, but yeah, I think it's so. But in terms of like functionality and can it make us, or do I think you're being silly by doing that? No, I think there's like a lot of room for functionality in clothing. Like I went through a bit of a denim head phase, as many of us did. And when you are wearing like 21-ounce selvage denim that's cut as slim as you can cut it, it stops working to a certain point. It's not comfortable. You can't move. It is hot in the summer and it's not warm enough in the winter. Like it doesn't work. And I think more and more, like, I've started wearing pants that have stretch in them, which can be sort of like a bad word in certain circles, but like it's so much more comfortable. And to me, it's so much like it works better. So no, I think there is a lot of room for clothing that works better and makes their wearers more comfortable, more efficient, more effective, the things that they have to do. And to me, it's like the sort of savings there, or I don't know if the sort of ground to be gained there. I don't know if it's necessarily in sort of like I mean, maybe it's inefficiency. Maybe if you can kind of like access your wallet or whatever it may be, maybe there is room to be gained there. But to me, it's just kind of in like comfort and agency, you know, comfort in just like that you can move and that you are the right temperature and that you have sort of like soft materials against your skin, things like that. And agency just in sort of like feeling like you can always do the things that you need to do. I think though that's sort of like the real ground to be gained there.
What sort of role do you think craftsmanship, and I mean tailoring craftsmanship, garment construction craftsmanship, what sort of role do you think that plays in society? I mean, we all know exactly what the metal worker can do and what benefits they contribute to society. What the carpenter does, what a like you say, an architect does, or a builder. What contributions are tailors and garment construction is, and maybe fashion designers even, actually making to society? You think, or can the potential?
Yeah, I mean, to me, clothing is sort of unique in that pretty much everyone consumes it. Pretty much everyone wears clothing, you know? And I think when people have clothing that isn't comfortable, that doesn't sort of serve them, that doesn't work in the way that they need it to work, I think that's when, and they may not even know it, but that's when, you know, the utility of the tailor, of the pattern maker, of the garment worker, that's when that comes in, you know? And I think especially like in the West, you know, I think people have gotten so disconnected from how our clothes are made. Like there'll be times when somebody will say like, oh, I like that jacket, those pants, whatever. And I say, oh, thank you. And they say, where did you get it? And I say, oh, I made it. They don't understand what I mean. Like they are truly like, what do you mean you made it? And I'm like, I made it on a sewing machine. And they're like, a sewing machine? My mom has one of those. And it's like, yes, that's how you make clothing. And I remember I was talking to somebody who was a good friend who I've known for many years. And they were the idea of, when I said something was hand sewn, they said, well, somebody didn't sit at a sewing machine and sew that. And I was like, not only is everything is sewn on a sewing machine. I was like, hand sewn means it was sewn with a needle and thread and nothing more. And it blew their mind. The idea that every piece of clothing in their closet was sewn on a sewing machine by a human whose hands have touched it was totally outside of their understanding world worked, you know. And I think that that's the case. I think most people, it's like they order things online, they get sort of a box with a shrink wrapped garment inside of it, and they don't think about how that garment was made, you know. And so as far as like what the utility is of, you know, I think if you have like the garment worker, I think it's hugely important in today's society. You know, again, like everybody wears clothing. I think there's this idea that there's a small subset of the population that is like interested in clothing. And I think actually like everyone is interested in clothing. They just sort of don't realize it. But I think of the garment worker, it's 100% important. And I think people are starting to find that of like the technician, of the pattern maker, of the tailor, of the, you know, whatever you want to call it, the person who actually sort of like makes the clothing happen. I think that's only becoming more and more important kind of as it fades. You know, I think that there are fewer and fewer people who know how to cut a pattern, who know how to construct a garment. I think there's fewer and fewer of those people in the world, and thus the importance of them is only becoming more important. I for many years was the head pattern maker for Michael Andrews, who spoke in New York. And there was one time when we consulted with like a large apparel manufacturer, and they were trying to make sort of like a thing that was like a modern interpretation of a tailored garment, you know, like a suit jacket that was sort of a more updated version of it. And they were on maybe like their fifth sample, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. Like they just weren't achieving what they wanted to. So they sort of asked us to come to one of their fittings, and we walked in the room, and there was a product developer, a creative director, a technical designer, you know, design assistants, etc. There was probably 6 or 7 people there, and then a fit model, and nobody knew how to actually make the jacket. Nobody knew how to make the pattern. And there was a degree to which I was like, well, you know, no wonder you're not achieving the thing that you want, because nobody here knows how to do it. You know, it's like if you had a bunch of people who weren't musicians, sit in a music studio with a keyboard and a guitar and drum and bass and wonder why the song isn't coming out the way that they wanted it to, you know? And so I think that the importance of, you know, and it's, I think as far as like, you know, if you say specifically of like a tailor, sort of like a Savile Row style tailor who like sews everything by hand, who sews everything by hand, I think like where their place in society is obviously sort of like shifting. But I think for people who know how to make things, I think there will always be a place for them in society. And I think it's only getting more important now.
Well, one thing I wanted to ask you as well was that, and this is probably linked to pretty much all the other questions that we have talked about, made to measure, the industry of made to measure and ready-made garments, right? We just talked about how a lot of people don't know where their clothing comes from, right? At the same time, what I'm seeing is I am seeing a lot of development in the made-to-measure and ready-to-wear industry, and it's kind of like shifting to something like made-to-order. I don't know what new terms they're going to come up with, but whatever it's going to be like probably on-demand clothing for the consumer, because they've worked out some efficient way of just producing that one thing, right? The just-in-time manufacturing on a personal level.
Right.
The first question I have is, why do you think that made to measure has been able to develop so many consistent products, successful products, along with ready to wear, and has created this huge gap in technological advancement compared to traditional tailors? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of like a few things going on there. I think one is that for decades, any amount of personalization totally went away, you know. And I remember I was talking to an older tailor who had been around. He was a third generation tailor. His grandfather was a tailor, then his father, and then him. And he was, I think, in his 60s, and he was saying, you know, in the 50s and 60s, the idea of like bespoke clothing seemed old fashioned. Like people didn't want it. It was exciting that something was ready to wear. It was exciting that it was mass produced, you know, and they wanted it to be like, oh, I went to a department store and I got this suit off the rack. Like it was sort of an exciting thing. And I think, you know, it initially is when you have these sort of like long lead times and these long production cycles, it's the efficiency is just sort of like so undeniable that it just went away entirely. And I think that, you know, in making things bespoke and making things custom, we often talk about, you know, you want your sort of, so many people are like, you speak about like the bell curve of people. So if you say people who have a 40-inch chest, and I guess this is, you talk about this both in custom as well as in ready to wear. If you say, okay, you have people who have a 40-inch chest, how long is their arm on average? There's sort of a peak of the bell curve where most people's arms, you know, or at least, you know, 50% of people's arms are going to be between, you know, 24 and 26 inches. But then as you go further out, you'll have people whose arms are 23 and 27 inches. And, you know, as it goes further and further, there could be somebody who has a 40-inch chest that is, you know, 4'11", and they have very different proportions than, you know, the person who's like sort of right at the middle of that bell curve. So I think that you end up with a lot of people who just like, again, aren't being served by the clothing that's available. And I think there's also becoming more visibility to sort of like people whose bodies are, you know, outside of that bell curve, or at least, you know, outside of the dead center of it. And I also think that there's a lot of people who, and so it's like, you know, as clothing becomes easier to manufacture on a smaller scale and faster to deliver on a smaller scale with the sort of same efficiencies and cost savings of large scale manufacture, it only sort of makes more and more sense. And it essentially, you know, creates a gap in the market that people are starting to fill now. But I also think that there's a lot of people who maybe they just have like unusually long arms. So the only thing that they need is longer sleeves, or they have just, it's a little tight in the stomach. So they just need a little bit bigger stomach. There's a lot of room, I think, for people who don't sort of need a full bespoke garment, who, you know, aren't shaped like this or this, or, you know, who don't have very unusual shapes, who can be well served by a made to measure garment, where the base pattern is pretty good, fits, people are in the dead center of that bell curve, and then they just have like slightly unusually long arms and just need longer sleeves or something like that. Like, I think there are a lot of people who are sort of well served by that. Yeah. The thing that I think is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that, so essentially, if I recap what you just said, was that there was a time where it was really popular to get like ready to wear garments. And then at some point, some of the population couldn't get their needs met through those ready to wear garments. But they also didn't want a full bespoke. That's where made to measure popped up and then turned into like a success story. Is that roughly speaking what you were saying?
Yeah, definitely. And that made to measure has become sort of easier to deliver with, modern manufacturing.
Now, why do you think that they have made so much progress in the technological field? Like, at least as far as I'm interpreting from what I've been studying so far, is almost all the development, like the technical development in garment construction and in tailoring, even in tailoring, in traditional tailoring, or even in like software, like investments in software, etc. They all come from industries where at some point at least mass production was necessary. Now, I don't know, and this is probably like partially true, but I don't know if mass production is necessarily an important factor in improving something and wanting to invest in new ways of doing it and innovation, or it's just a risk factor. Like, hey, we have to reduce risk and we don't really want to innovate, but because there is this risk of mass scale failure, we have to innovate. So what do you think is going on?
I mean, I don't know that I have like a solid answer for that. It's definitely sort of a little more philosophical, but like,
sure.
I mean, I would think I would imagine it's just kind of like market value, market influence. That if you have sort of mass manufacture behind something, it means even with incremental improvements, you're going to sort of get, financial returns on that. So I think just, anytime something, I think people often like lose track of the effects of like the small things over a large population. Basically, so if you can save if you can save like an inch of fabric of your of the amount of fabric that it takes to make a jacket, and you're making 150,000 jackets, then it makes a big difference, and it makes for real effects in terms of how much fabric you need, how much that's going to cost you, what your profit and loss is going to be, et cetera, et cetera. So I think when you have that large scale manufacturer, you have real incentive to innovate and to improve. So I would think that that's it. But yeah, I mean, that makes a ton of sense. That's where you see that is in that anywhere where there's been mass manufacture. Yeah.
I mean, you've worked with manufacturers before, and you've communicated a lot with them. What has been your takeaway in working with manufacturers versus individual artisans who may do a sampling thing for you?
I would say that like the biggest difference between somebody who's like an individual sample maker, an individual tailor, an individual person making a single product versus like a larger scale production is that the larger scale production will do exactly what you tell them to, whether it's right or wrong. And I think people sometimes don't realize that until it's too late. And you have some problem that you never would have anticipated because you would have thought somebody would have had a little bit more critical thought to it. But, it's like the goal of a factory is to, every individual person is sort of doing one single part of something. So they don't, it's, if they decide to put their own interpretation into it, it could go sideways. And, there needs to, when you're sort of putting something, growing the scale of something to a large scale production, every person has to do exactly what they're supposed to do. And ideally there's somebody sort of designing that production to make the final product what the designed product is. But it's not uncommon that people will make a mistake either the pattern maker makes a mistake, the production designer, or excuse me, the product manager gets the wrong zipper, or, who knows what. Maybe the lining, they delivered the wrong color or something like that. And people don't realize it until you sort of have a bunch of jackets ready to ship and they all have pink lining and, the wrong button on it. And you sort of wonder, like, what happened? Didn't anybody notice this? And it's like, no, that's what was provided to them. That was what was on the pattern. That was what was on the cutting ticket, what have you. And that's, I think, something that a lot of people sort of like lose track of, is that a production will do exactly what you ask them to do, even if you don't realize what you're asking them to do.
Okay. Let's do a speed round. I've got a few things written down based on our conversation. You tell me the first thing that pops up your mind. So, the role of clothing in society.
More important than people realize.
All right. Okay. Digital pattern cutting.
Efficiency.
All right. Tailoring in New York.
Dying.
What about tailoring in the
States?
States?
And maybe dying and being reborn as we speak. Maybe both of them at the same time. Yeah, I think tailoring in New York. I like to think that there's a lot of new young people with new interesting ideas, but I think at the same time there's a lot of these sort of, the garment district is just becoming more and more atrophied with every year. And, there's a few sort of holdouts. Like Martin Greenfield is the one sort of like obvious example of sort of a large scale factory where there's still somebody sort of like making quality product. But I think more and more it's just like the talent pool isn't really there of makers. There's not too many people who can make a suit anymore, especially in the States. So I think it's still there, and that, hopefully there's sort of more energy that's going to go into it. But I think it gets smaller and smaller every year.
Okay. The future of tailoring.
Exciting. I think there's a lot of room, as I think people, people often sort of speak about like the death of the suit. And to me, it is almost sort of like surprising that it hasn't completely died at this point. You know what I mean? You would think that there is, with its, I don't want to say lack of utility or whatever, and just the fact that it isn't required in most workplaces, you would think that it would be less common than it is. But I think people still really hold the suit as this revered item and this, powerful part of our society and of our social consciousness. And I think when you have something like that, that's that powerful, and you sort of strip away kind of those social restrictions of, well, it has to be, XYZ, you get some very interesting things that start to happen. People playing with proportion. So when you look at like the suiting that's made by somebody like Yohji Yamamoto, or you look at the suiting that's made by Rick Owens, where people are doing sort of like really strange, unusual things, I think there's a lot of interesting ground. And I think the fact that the suit isn't dead yet means it's not going to die anytime soon. Like I think in my lifetime and yours, I think it's still going to be around in some form or another.
Smart clothing.
I would say like overhyped. I don't know. I think there's a lot of people calling things smart clothing. And I don't know, things like that will tell you, I don't know, like your pulse or your blood sugar levels or things like this. I don't know that that's what people want their clothes to do. I think those are going to be, I think if there really is a demand there, which seems like there is from the number of people who wear Apple Watches and things like that. I think I once heard somebody say that the only time you'll see like a universally accepted wearable device is when it becomes invisible. I think that there is sort of some social cachet to wearing an Apple Watch, but I also think there's like a social aversion of some people to wear an Apple Watch. And so I think it's like there is some utility to that, obviously, for health, and especially now where I've heard that they're working on things that, for example, when an old person falls, or when a person with mobility issues falls, oftentimes that expresses itself in their gait for days leading up to it, meaning they start to shuffle a little bit. There's some sort of change that happens in the way that they walk that then leads them to fall within a few days. And so there are people working on things that will warn you a few days ahead of time, that will say, hey, you're starting to drag your foot. Hey, you're, and that other things will happen, like to your blood pressure or things like that. And they'll be able to sort of warn you before. And so I think the utility will only become greater and greater to sort of like wearable technology. But I don't know if people want that in their clothing. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yes.
I think people want their clothes to have more, to be like more personal than that. So.
Yeah. I agree. I think a phone has already enough notifications banging against our head, but clothing on top of that, telling you about your blood sugar is something. It's like a disaster almost every 5 minutes. All right. Okay. Form.
Form.
Yes, versus function. Form and function.
I think that's a tough one. I mean, almost more important than function, I suppose. I mean, I think especially if you look at like textiles that have function, whether it's, like water resistance or stretch or insulation or whatever, it's like so much of that is so available that the fact that like most clothing isn't made out of that, I think speaks to the fact that people really want something more nurturing from their clothing than just sort of pure function. So I think, form, the fact that I think it's more important than function to people internally.
Okay, I've got two more. Made to measure.
Made to measure, like filling a gap, and I think will only sort of continue to grow as a part of the market.
And last but not least, Savile Row.
Savile Row. I've only visited Savile Row once. I don't know. I feel like I feel like you're setting me up here. I would say like it struck me as sort of a museum. Right. It's a bit anachronistic, and it sort of speaks to another time. It was my perception of it, and I'm by no means an expert in Savile Row, so I don't want to speak out of turn here. But it's I think it's important to know it. I think it's important that it still exists and that it stays around. But I think it's fewer and fewer people will patronize it. Will continue to sort of get suits there, both because of cost and because of changing styles and attitudes. But I think it's important to sort of have that heritage and to have that connection to how people got here, and how we all sort of developed what we have now.
Tony, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. I've learned a lot of things, a lot of new insights, and I look forward to talk to you again.
Yeah, fantastic. I had a fantastic time. I really appreciate you inviting me, and we'll have to do it again soon sometime. Hopefully in person one day.
Yeah, man, that would be nice. I would love to visit New York. And that was Tony. I hope you all enjoyed the conversation. What do you guys think? Do you think that digital pattern making software is something that we have to embrace as traditional tailors? Or do you think that it could help us to develop our craft even more? I'd like to know your thoughts. So if you have any thoughts, comments, or ideas, or anything you'd like to share, drop them in the comment section below, and I hope to see you again in the next episode. Until then, bye-bye.